Welcome to What is Going for new thought from the edge of Each week on OMTimes flagship radio show, veteran broadcaster, author, and media consultant Sandie conducts thought-provoking interviews with inspirational authors, artists, musicians, scientists, speakers, and filmmakers who are working at the point where spirituality and science meet consciousness at the very edge of Here is your host, Sandie Sedgbeer.
Hello. The science is overwhelming. The facts are in. The planet is heating up at an alarming rate, and the results are everywhere to be seen. Yet, as time runs out, climate progress is blocked by the men who are profiting from the burning of the planet. Dick Russell is an acclaimed environmental writer, activist, lecturer, and author of 13 books on subjects ranging from natural history to the assassination of President Kennedy. His latest book, Horsemen of the Apocalypse, The Men Who Are Destroying Life on Earth and What It Means to Our Children, written with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., before Trump came to power, lays bare the sordid truth about the energy moguls most responsible for the climate disaster that our civilization is facing. Dick Russell joins me today to expose the men behind the lies and the cover-ups about the severe impacts of climate change. He's going to tell us what motivates them to put their profits and careers ahead of the health and welfare of their own children, grandchildren, and the rest of us. And on a more positive note, he's going to reveal the rebellious descendants of the fossil fuel families who are trying to make a difference toward a more sustainable world. Dick Russell, welcome.
Thank you, Sandie. Good to be with you today.
Dick, Horsemen of the Apocalypse focuses on the energy moguls that are most responsible for the disaster that we're facing. With the election of Trump, many of the people profiled in your book are now in ultimate positions of power. When you and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. first conceived this book, did you have any idea that it would be so prophetic?
Absolutely not. And that's really the most alarming aspect of the book coming out right now. I mean, Rex Tillerson, who was one of the main people that I profiled in the book, that was the head of Exxon Mobil, had been for some years, and suddenly he's become Secretary of State. Scott Pruitt, who's now running the EPA, had been the protege of Harold Hamm, who is this fracker extraordinaire, I guess you'd say, pioneering of hydraulic natural gas fracturing of the earth in Oklahoma, and Hamm had been behind him for a long time, pushing him forward. As Oklahoma's Attorney General, Harold Hamm was one of the horsemen that I profiled as well. I mean, one after another, the Koch brothers from Wichita suddenly had their congressperson that they'd installed, really, in Wichita, Kansas, their home base, becoming the head of the CIA. I mean, it was just staggering to see what happened after Donald Trump took office.
Well, at the same time, for the rest of the world, it's a really good thing your book has come out right now, because at least we can be alerted to the truth.
Well, I hope so. That's obviously why I wrote it, to try to get the word out and make people realize, I mean, the facts have been in for a long time, that the disaster that we're facing is going to cripple civilization, and it's not that far away. I mean, 16 of the past 17 years have seen record-setting temperatures all over the world. What's really scary, of course, and we can get into more of this as we talk, but is the Arctic Ocean is heating 20 to 30 degrees above normal last summer. Sea ice there is at an all-time low. Oceans are rising more than they have since the last ice age. I mean, there is absolutely no doubt that climate change is happening at an accelerating pace, and that human beings, basically the big fossil fuel companies, are more responsible for this than anything else, and there's just no scientific doubt about it anymore.
And of course, just yesterday, the New York Times published an unreleased draft, the Federal Scientists' Climate Report, released, apparently leaked before Trump could bury it. So the timing does seem to be very, very interesting.
Yes, I read that piece, and it's, of course, what I think it was leaked because the scientists who have written this report, which is very alarming and shows that the temperature is going to rise by at least 2 degrees Celsius, unless we do something, even if we do something today. And I think they released the report because they're to the Times because they're very afraid it's going to be suppressed by the Trump administration, that they won't even release it. So that's what's really, we're living in an Orwellian world where alt facts are put forward by the Trump administration as reality, and the terrifying facts about global warming, climate change are being buried. And that's been true from day one when the administration came in, when they started censoring, removing all information about climate change and its dire effects from the websites of the EPA and NASA and Department of Agriculture, everybody else.
And the really scary thing is how many people, believe the lies, believe the alt facts.
Yeah, that is really scary. I mean, it kind of boggles the mind. We're looking. I mean, even this summer, look at what's happening in Europe. They're calling it the summer of Lucifer. I mean, the temperatures there are just skyrocketing astronomically. I mean, in Seattle and Portland in this country, we had temperatures close to 110 degrees on certain days. And yet, people still seem to want to, not everybody, but a lot of people just want to bury their heads in the sand. I don't know if it's because it's just too much to bear to realize that we have to change the way we run our cars and our home energy systems, and we've got to do it yesterday, and people don't want to deal with that. I just, it's kind of baffling to me, actually.
I think, it gets to the point where so many unthinkable things happen that people get overwhelmed by it. They just can't take anymore, they shut down.
Yeah, they do, sure. I mean, denial is a natural human, thing, and if it's too much to bear, no matter what it is, if it's some, one of our relatives going to jail or our children's having a breakdown or whatever, I mean, people just often have a really hard time dealing with it, and that's what's going on certainly with climate change, because even though we've seen more people on the streets, I mean, the marches are getting bigger, and that's been certainly true this year, but at the same time, we're not seeing the kind of public outcry that really would force change. And of course, right now, these guys aren't going to change no matter what we do. And who knows what we're going to have to do to make something different.
Well, your book details, the cover-ups have been going on for 30 years. I mean, tell us a little bit of the history. Give us the context here of, what's been going on, how it started, where it started, and why it started.
Well, it really started, Exxon Mobil, for example, or before they were Exxon Mobil, back when they were just Exxon, they had their own scientists studying what was going on with the climate way back, 30, 40 years ago. And when their own scientists began coming in and saying, hey, there's going to be a big problem, they, instead of going forward with this in terms of any public recognition of it, they started funding these climate-denying scientists. And paying big money to scientists like Willie Soon from Harvard and others to basically say, well, there's a lot of doubt about this situation. We can't really be sure that it's happening, and it's shocking actually. But it started under Lee Raymond, who was the Exxon CEO before Rex Tillerson. And they did everything they could to fund people, people in political positions. Of course, when the Bush administration came in, it was much easier than it would have been had Al Gore become president, as he should have been, rightfully. But, the Bush administration just completely went along. They called in Exxon right from the first day one, and Exxon was successful in stopping the Kyoto Protocol from being implemented by the U.S. at that time. At the same time, what Exxon was doing was their own scientists were discovering, their research and development teams were coming up with alternative energy that was going to change things. And Exxon, today we have the Toyota Prius is the leading edge hybrid electric car in the world, and we own one. My family owns actually more than one, and Exxon was ahead of the curve. I mean, they were making the motors for these hybrid vehicles and actually supplying them to Toyota, and then completely shut that research division down and let go of things like fuel cell development, which could totally change things. They had a guy named Pat Grimes, who I write about in the book, who was a genius and was very into fuel cells and hybrid cars and all of that, way ahead of his time. And he had patent applications going back into the 1950s that Exxon Mobil had that they just basically buried because they didn't think it was going to be as profitable as their oil and gas business. So that's just an example of Exxon and what they did. All of the big fossil fuel companies were involved in covering up what was going on with the climate and, in fact, paying scientists to claim that it wasn't as bad as we're now seeing it is.
All of these things, things can escalate over a number of years, but they all start somewhere with one person, who thinks it's a good idea or who has a particular agenda.
Yes.
We hear a lot lately about the Koch brothers and, what their ultimate agenda is. Just yesterday I was reading an article about, there's a choice to be made with the Republicans. Do they let go of Trump? And if they do, what actually happens? Then we actually see what the agenda truly is.
Right.
If Pence gets in, because, they want him in. Tell us a little bit about the Koch brothers, because I don't think people really understand who they are. Oh, I'm sorry, we're going to have to go to a break now. We'll be back in a few moments, Dick.
Okay.
You're listening to What is Going On. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and my guest is environmental writer and best-selling author Dick Russell, and I'm talking about his latest book, The Horsemen of the Apocalypse. We'll be back in a few moments after the break.
The future of Internet radio is here. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM.
Change and growth are part of natural life and also part of your spiritual life. Everyone needs support and guidance, especially during life passages. Upgrade yourself with the OMTimes Experts program. With OMTimes Experts, you have access to the best intuitive coaches, spiritual teachers, counselors, astrologists, and oracles. Our team was carefully selected so you can trust. Find out more at experts.omtimes.com.
Hello, I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, host of OMTimes Radio's What is Going On show. If you've been on a spiritual journey and know yourself to be more than just your body, mind and emotions, yet still struggle to fully love yourself and the life you're living, if you experience childhood challenges that continue to play out as limiting patterns in your daily life, if you long for success in your relationships and career but keep finding it eludes you, the Journey Back to Love Symposium will not only dramatically shift your perceptions about love, but also help you understand and integrate all the places where you may have secretly believed you were broken. Filmed over 7 days with 8 internationally renowned teachers and speakers, the Journey Back to Love Symposium series is packed with life-transforming insights, tools, practical processes, gifts, and wisdom. So, if you're ready to transform your beliefs about love, success, and freedom, and to finally put all your perceived limitations, fears, and failures in your relationships and life behind you, I invite you to visit thejourneybacktolovesymposium.com and start your journey back to love at a huge discount with the coupon code JBL3.
More than 24 million Americans have an autoimmune disorder, and that number continues to grow. I'm Sharon Saylor, and I'm one of those 24 million. To put that number in perspective, cancer affects about 9 million and heart disease up to 22 million. That's why I've brought together top experts and those thriving regardless of their diagnosis to bring you the latest, most up-to-date information. Join me, Sharon Saylor, Friday night, 7 p.m. Eastern, for the Autoimmune Hour on Life Interrupted Radio to find out how to live your life uninterrupted.
My name is Meera Batra, and this is How I Live United. Many families have come to America for a better life. I advocate for these families with United Way. United Way empowers them to see opportunities available. We help them get involved with their kids' schools and network within the community. My name is Meera Batra. I help families see opportunity and succeed. I don't just wear the shirt, I live it.
Give, advocate, volunteer. Live United. Go to liveunited.org. Brought to you by United Way and the Ad Council.
Welcome back. Dick Russell, you were going to tell us about the Koch brothers.
Yes, the Koch brothers, Charles and David Koch, well, their wealth was estimated a couple of years ago at more than $50 billion apiece. So they are the wealthiest fossil fuel private magnates in the world. And their company, they're based in Kansas, in Wichita. And I'm originally from Kansas. I went to school at the University of Kansas, but I certainly never heard of them back in the day. And they were under the radar for many, many years until Jane Mayer, a writer for The New Yorker, did a piece, I guess it must be 7 or 8 years ago now, exposing these guys. And like a number of wealthy people who don't want to be known because of what they may be doing, the Koch brothers were certainly among those until Jane Mayer's piece. And their companies, Koch Industries, go back to their father, Fred Koch, started them in 1925 in Kansas, and he and a business partner developed this superior process for refining oil, but then they got forced out of the American market by these patent infringement lawsuits from their competitors. So Fred Koch, the father, actually made his fortune in Stalin's industrializing Soviet Union and then by building refineries in Hitler's Germany. So from that, Koch Industries has grown to employ over 100,000 people in more than 60 countries and bring in about $115 billion a year in revenue. And the Koch brothers own more than 4,000 miles of pipelines. They're the planet's largest exporter of oil from the tar sands in Canada and the second largest private company in the entire U.S. So that's kind of the basic background on them. But they've been involved in denying that climate change is happening for a long, long time. And this is one thing I put in the book that I learned that really kind of blew me away is that they do all this charitable work, right? And so David Koch was on the board of the Smithsonian Institution, and they even named their Hall of Human Origins after him. It opened in Washington, I guess, about 6 or 7 years ago. And so they've got this interactive game in the exhibit, and it says that in the event that climate becomes intolerable in the future, we're just going to build underground cities, and we're going to develop either short, compact bodies or curved spines, so that moving around in tight spaces is not going to be a problem. So we could laugh if it was funny, but that's really the attitude of the Koch brothers about what climate change is going to do to the world.
So, okay, we know a little bit about their background, but who are these men? Are they completely morally bankrupt?
I've never met them. I went to Kansas. I tried to get an interview, but of course they didn't want to talk to me. So I interviewed a lot of the activists there who've been fighting for wind power in the state and running up against the Koch brothers, having bought up the Kansas legislature and turning what was moving very quickly into a Kansas has great wind, and so does Texas and Iowa and various states, and so wind power was becoming a real factor, and they were going to go along with the Clean Power Plan, cutting back the emissions from power plant utilities because they were moving to wind energy. So so why would the Koch brothers then set out to just not gut it really, but get rid of the voluntary requirement that is making this happen? And so it's baffling in a sense. I think they justify themselves ideologically and claim that the free market is what they're really about and that everything should be gauged by that. But of course, it's their form of denial of what they're doing to the planet. So in that sense, yeah, I would say that they're morally bankrupt. They just don't give a damn.
And now their hand-picked U.S. representative, Mike Pompeo, is running the CIA. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct. And Mike Pompeo came into the Congress. What was it, in 2012, something like that? And he was the Wichita congressman, and basically what his job was to do the Koch brothers' bidding. He got more campaign donations from the Kochs than anybody else in the Congress. He was a Tea Party guy who was on the House Intelligence Committee. That's his only claim to anything to do with the CIA. And he thought the CIA's detention and interrogation programs were fine. He had a chief of staff who had been a lobbyist for the Kochs. And right from the moment he came into the House, it was in 2011, the first thing he did was oppose the Obama administration's plan to create a registry at the Environmental Protection Agency of the greenhouse gas polluters. And then he introduced legislation to kill tax credits for wind power, saying it's got to compete on its own. In other words, everything that Pompeo was for basically was what the Koch brothers were for. And now, suddenly he's running this massive intelligence agency that we know a lot of the history about, the CIA. So it's interesting that the Koch brothers did not support Donald Trump during the election campaign. In fact, they were afraid of him, I think, in some ways, that he would be too much of a wild card. But then their guy, the guy that has been receiving tremendous amounts of campaign contributions from the Kochs for years, is Mike Pence. And once Pence became the vice presidential candidate, the Koch brothers then began to have a lot more interest and influence in what the Trump administration was going to be doing.
So really, they're quite happy with Trump doing some of the ridiculous, things that he's being condemned for, because they really don't care about him. They would like to have Pence in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what they're looking at in the future. I mean, if Trump gets caught now by the whole Russia thing or his financial problems that are being investigated by Mueller, then Pence will come in, and that will be, as you mentioned earlier, the victory that these guys have been looking for a long time, because Pence is much subtler, obviously, and in that sense perhaps even more malevolent than Trump, who at least what you're getting. I mean, with his crazy tweets every night.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, so many people are wanting Trump out, but they don't think about the consequences of that. Talk about the devil,
Yeah, exactly. And so I don't know. Was the whole thing a setup? I mean, I suppose it's possible, but it's like everywhere you look, the lie about when Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, which I'm sure the Koch brothers are very happy about, and Tillerson claimed he wanted us to stay in, but paid lip service to it. But Trump was claiming that we're going to see all these lost jobs from the Climate Accord. I think he said it was 2.7 million jobs would be lost by 2025. And maybe as much as $3 trillion. And, he always talks these massive economic figures, the cost of trying to deal with changing the way our energy sources are. And, the fact is that by 2030, the scientists, the economists who studied this see a $6 trillion market for renewable energy. I mean, already, and we can talk about this further later, but, we've seen the solar jobs in solar go from 24,000 only a decade ago to 260,000 jobs in our country today. I mean, that's a huge, huge shift. And how at the same time, with the Trump budget cuts to the Energy Star efficiency program, for example, I mean, that has saved people on their utility bills more than $400 billion and kept almost 3 billion metric tons of carbon out of the atmosphere. And yet this is one of the first programs to be sacrificed as part of the EPA budget. I mean, it's just mind-boggling.
It is mind-boggling. I mean, your book, I have to say, it's stunning. it's also sickening. And I don't mean that as, derogatory to you. It's just the scale of this and the, the wanton lack of any morals at all is just mind-boggling. I mean, everything that we think about humanity and that, the higher values that we all share. And when you read some of the stuff in your book, it's like, my goodness, I've never really believed in the devil, but it seems to me that many of these people could be called the devil's spawn.
I'm afraid you've got it. I think so too. And when you have wanton people who've got to know that they're lying. I mean, one of the guys I profile in the book is this guy Rick Berman, who's been a shill for the fossil fuel companies for a long time, and he's a public relations genius, so-called. And I start off when I write about him by he's talking about how the New York Times some years back published, because somebody there at this big meeting of fossil fuel executives taped what Berman was saying and then gave it to the Times. So that's the only reason we know of some of the things Berman said, which were, you can either win dirty or lose pretty. You think of this as an endless war that you've got a budget for. This was to fossil fuel execs. He said you've got to exploit emotions like fear and greed and anger, anything to diminish the other side's ability to operate. He says you could not get into people's heads and convince them to do something as easily as you could get into their hearts or into their guts to convince them, because emotions drive people a lot better than intellectual epiphany. So he says if you want a video to go viral, have kids or animals. Now, that to me, in order to promote a diabolic point, really. Yeah, I mean, he was called by 60 Minutes back in 2007. They called him Dr. Evil, and I don't think that's an exaggeration.
You're listening to What is Going On. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and I'm speaking with environmental journalist and author Dick Russell about his latest book, Horsemen of the Apocalypse, The Men Who Are Destroying Life on Earth and What It Means to Our Children, written with Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. After the break, the rebellious descendants of the fossil fuel families who are trying to make a difference toward a more sustainable world. Stay tuned.
The cutting edge of conscious radio, OMTimes Radio, IOM-FM. Being a radio host on IOM-FM allows you to build your show on a rich platform with the power of the Internet to fulfill your outreach goals and connect with a very specialized and global online audience, unlimited by time and distance. OMTimes Radio will provide you with web relevance, a recognizable conscious brand, and with the standard of excellence that has accompanied every single OMTimes endeavor. Host your show with OMTimes Radio Network.
My name is Victor Furman. Some call me The Voice. I've always been fascinated with human nature, spirituality, science, and the crossroads at which they meet. Join me Wednesdays at 8 p.m. Eastern on OMTimes Radio, and we'll explore these topics and so much more on Destination Unlimited.
I am Fidel Nsombo. I was born in a city called the Bukavu in the Congo. We were a loving family, and then, boom, everything that I had disappeared in a single day. People think that when you are a refugee and they resettle you to America and all your problems are done. They don't understand that that's the beginning of everything. I was not born a refugee. I was made one.
It's time we welcome refugee families with open arms. Learn more at embracerefugees.org, brought to you by the Ad Council.
Welcome back. Dick Russell, I was at the Sister Giant conference back in, I think it was February, and I watched Josh Fox, who made the movie Gasland, was there, and I watched a little bit of his movie about fracking. You talk in your book about how Oklahoma billionaire Howard Hamm paid off the local university in an attempt to cover up its geological studies, showing how fracking is behind the state's huge increase in earthquakes. I mean, tell us a little bit about Harold Hamm.
Yeah, Harold Hamm is one of the wealthiest people in the country. He's a multi-billionaire. He hit the Bakken oil shale field in South Dakota was his big pioneering discovery, I guess. But he's very powerful, and he's been connected to the University of Oklahoma for some time. He's been on their board of trustees. He was very close to the president, David Boren, a former U.S. senator from Oklahoma. Of course, Oklahoma was built on oil, and it's still driving the economy there. But what went on was there was a geologist at the university named Austin Holland. He was with the Oklahoma Geological Survey, so it was part of the university's College of Earth and Energy. And suddenly Holland began studying these tremors that were plaguing about 500,000 mostly rural people who lived in the central and north central parts of the state. Because Oklahoma, people may not realize, has gone from experiencing almost no earthquakes to now being the earthquake capital of the United States, including one of them which registered as high, a couple of them now as high as 5.6 on the Richter scale, and people have lost their homes, and it's really been quite scary, and nobody for a long time supposedly knew why this was happening. Well, the University of Oklahoma did, and they began talking about the fact that the hydraulic fracturing of natural gas, which was sending all this wastewater down into the earth from the process, was triggering earthquakes because Oklahoma has a geological formation that's fragile, and similar to Texas and other states have also been seeing some of the increase in earthquakes. But basically, they had a meeting where Hamm came in and met with Boren and met with the geologist and began sort of dropping subtle hints, not that he'd better lay off of this and not talk about it, or he was going to end up losing his job. Well, he eventually resigned from the survey. By that point, I mean, it took several years before the Oklahoma governor, Mary Fallin, would admit that, yeah, we're looking into this, and it does look like the hydraulic fracturing process is causing an increase in the earthquakes. So, but it's been a massive cover-up there for some time. And if you look at a place like Cushing, Oklahoma, where I visited when I went out there, and that's this place that has it's the pipeline crossroads of the world. So they've got they used to have a lot of oil production there, but they have these thousands of miles of pipelines under Cushing, stretching out toward distribution hubs all across the country. And the fact is, if an earthquake hit at that particular spot, and I drove through there, and it's like the tank farm just goes on for miles and miles, you'd see a natural disaster. I mean, with the flaring going into we'd see huge fires there. And people, they used to think it would be a main possibility for a terrorist attack as a target, but the fact is that the terrorists are right there in their own
exactly
state.
homegrown.
Homegrown, and so Hamm has been very much involved in covering this up, and he also was, as I mentioned earlier briefly, he's been a big promoter of Scott Pruitt, and when Pruitt became Attorney General of Oklahoma, now he's running our federal EPA. He enlisted all these attorney generals from other states to join lawsuits to try to gut the Clean Power Plan that had been put forward by the Obama administration, so that they would not have to implement it. And there, Hamm was right there, touting whatever Pruitt was doing, and at the same time, he became Trump's energy advisor. And in fact, Trump wanted him to run the Department of Energy, but he said he took a pass on that. Instead, we got Rick Perry, the former governor of Texas. So, in a nutshell, that's what's been going on in Oklahoma. And I talked to a number of activists there who were really terrified of what was going on and seeing their home values go down. And it's one of those little-known stories that's that's an example of what's happening because of the greed of these guys all over the country.
You know, fracking, I was horrified to read a few years ago when I was in England, which of course is my home, that the government were allowing local councils who are responsible, you know, they're making them responsible for budgets, and they're bribing them, saying, we will allow you more money in your budgets if you will accept fracking in your cities. And I mean, it's just appalling. I remember reading a few years ago that there was suspicion that there were a number of young adults dying, and I'm not sure which state, which places these were, but people felt there was a connection somewhere with fracking. Is there any truth in that?
Well, certainly when you watch Josh Fox's amazing documentary, Gasland, which was an awakening for me when I saw it, you know, you're seeing people with groundwater contamination, and they turn on their faucet in their home, and you know, bursts into flames. The water. I mean, it's like, wow, and people are drinking this. So you know, there's definite evidence that fracking causes contamination of water supplies, and thank goodness that Josh Fox did that documentary that shows this. I mean, you know, when fracking, hydraulic fracturing, as it's officially called, first came along, the people like the Obama administration was supporting it because natural gas is not as lethal a greenhouse gas as is produced by the carbon from coal or oil. So, you know, it was like, okay, if we go more to natural gas, then we're going to reduce our carbon emissions, which is true. If you know, natural gas is not as bad, but it has all these other effects that nobody knew about at the time. So now that we know them, and yet they're still trying to cover it up and push fracking forward all over the country, that to me is a crime against nature and humanity.
Well, let's look on the more positive side, because you also write about the descendants of many of these families who are trying to make a difference. I mean, you mentioned Richard Berman earlier, and in your book you talk about how his son has completely, rejected his father, denounced him publicly. Tell us about some of these people who are making a difference.
Yeah, well, I tried to see if there were a number of possible, young people from these fossil fuel families who would talk, and in fact there weren't. Even the ones who may not like what their fathers are doing, are unwilling to speak publicly against the family. Now, David Berman was an exception to that. He was the lead singer for a long time for a popular independent rock band called the Silver Jews. And a few years ago, he quit. He said he couldn't continue anymore, and he said a lot of it had to do with what his father did. And he came right out and said, "My father is a despicable man. He's an exploiter and a scoundrel." And he said, "I've tried for years I've demanded he stop his lies and his PR in his PR practice, and he hasn't, and he said he's really been wrestling to come to terms with that." So he's one who was certainly willing to come out and publicly speak about it. But there are others. One family that I greatly admire are the Rockefellers, because it all started with them. Standard Oil was the precursor to Exxon, and John D. Rockefeller began the whole oil boom in the world. But the newer generations of Rockefellers, first of all, they've been divesting from Exxon. They've been calling for things like, the forcing them to take climate change into consideration. I mean, that's down the line. And then there are some of them, like Chris Lindstrom, and he's the grandson of David Rockefeller, the Chase Manhattan banker who died just this year at the age of, I think, 101. And Chris has been out there, first of all, starting a bioenergy company in Jamaica. I know Chris. I interviewed him at a conference. There's a new organization called Nexus, N-E-X-U-S, which are children of inherited wealth who come together at a They have regular meetings. They have an annual conference at the United Nations where they bring together about 500 of them to talk about what can they do to make a different kind of world than their forefathers have created. And Chris was one of these. And his bioenergy company, he's now moved into the manufacturing of hemp. But he spoke to me and to people at Nexus about investing in companies that start moving resources into transforming the system itself. He said, I'll give a quote from him from my book. He said, "The first real necessity at this point is to compost the BS in our heads about the world we live in, that we're at the end of the line of a chain of living creatures and everything is here to benefit us. We have the technology to create renewable fuels that's been suppressed by the fossil fuel industry." So he set out to come up with working in Jamaica, a new form of bioenergy that would take waste and transform it into energy that would not pollute the atmosphere and also could create fertilizer. So you have people like Chris, and then I also interviewed a woman named Catherine Lorenz, whose grandfather, George Mitchell, had pioneered hydraulic fracturing or fracking, and back in the day, he was actually an environmentalist in some ways, and he did not know that the impact that fracking was going to have when he started touting it as a safer alternative than coal or oil. But Catherine Lorenz, his daughter, now runs the family foundation since his death, and she's the granddaughter. She knew him well, and she is really pushing hard in Texas for a vast increase in wind energy, and has had conferences about this. I found her a very interesting person and someone who's definitely devoted to creating a more sustainable world.
You're listening to What Is Going On. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and I'm speaking with environmental writer, activist and author Dick Russell about his latest book, Horsemen of the Apocalypse, the men who are destroying life on Earth and what it means to our children. We'll be back with more from Dick Russell after this break.
Bringing a more conscious lifestyle to your world. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM.
Spiritual, metaphysical, green living, psychic, alternative healing, life coaching. Do any of these or similar terms apply to your business or cause? If so, you are in a niche market with a very specific audience. Conscious Gate PR is the world's leading conscious public relations agency. With a global reach of over 4 million and growing, we offer comprehensive media campaigns to our targeted market. Learn more at ConsciousGatesPR.com. Conscious marketing for conscious minds.
Hello, I'm Lisa Berry. Join me every Monday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for Light on Living, a chance to see new, hear different, and feel more as I shine the spotlight on all the ways to lighten the load of life's challenges. Light on Living is your link to that new way you're looking for, that new understanding that will enhance your life, and that positive connection that will support your growth. So join me, and you'll gain insight and start to see things in a new way that motivates you.
If you own a gun, you have a full-time responsibility. When you aren't using it, be sure it can't get into the hands of curious children, troubled teenagers, a thief, or anyone else who might misuse it. Your family, friends, and neighbors are all counting on you. Remember, always, lock it up. For more information on firearm storage safety, visit ncpc.org. This message brought to you by the National Crime Prevention Council, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, and the Ad Council.
Welcome back. Dick Russell, I read an article yesterday online, how millennials could bring the oil industry to its knees. This was published in 2016 on oilprice.com. What is happening with the millennials, and do you think that they really are the ones that are going to change things? And do we have time to wait for them?
Well, we're running out of time to save civilization, really. And I think that more and more millennials, and especially even younger people, are starting to see this and really get out there and call for change. I mean, we've been seeing interesting, more civil disobedience. There was a case in 2013 where two young people blocked a ship from unloading, I guess, some 40,000 tons of coal at a power plant in Massachusetts, and they were charged, with disturbing the peace and conspiracy, and they argued that they didn't have any choice because of the imminent threat that climate change poses. And on the day the trial was about to start, I thought this was amazing. The DA of the county, Bristol County, reduced the charges to a small fine. And his reason was, he said, climate change is one of the gravest crises our planet's ever faced. In my humble opinion, the political leadership on this issue has been gravely lacking. And then the DA met with the accused young people and vowed to take part in the People's Climate March. So, you see shifts in consciousness like this, and one of them that really is very interesting to me, and has been called the most important lawsuit on the planet right now by activists like Bill McKibben and Naomi Klein, is a lawsuit that's been filed in a district court in Eugene, Oregon, by a group called Our Children's Trust. And the NASA scientist, James Hansen, who I knew way back in 1988 and interviewed him then about climate change, and he's a scientist who's become an activist, and he's gotten out there and said, we got to do something, and he's been called like a guardian for future generations. So what this lawsuit is about, with Hansen as part of it, along with young people ranging from, I think, the age of 8 to 19, and they're charging the federal government with violating their constitutional rights to life, liberty, and property by enabling the fossil fuel industry to keep on destroying our atmosphere. So they've been arguing this case before this court, and so far the judge has basically been very sympathetic to them and denied the efforts by the big fossil fuel companies. Exxon Mobil's been part of this, Koch Industries. They're all saying, this lawsuit should be dismissed. It's just a threat to their businesses, and the judge has sided with the plaintiffs, with the citizens who are trying to push this forward. So it's something to definitely keep an eye on, and you're seeing new young activists emerge. Like this young fellow he's 16 years old. He started something called the Earth Guardians in Colorado, and he's a hip-hop artist. I can't pronounce his name really, but it's sort of Shuatl Martinez. He's an Aztec, a descendant of the Aztecs, raised in their tradition, and he's spoken before the UN on behalf of his generation. So, you do see some positive action going on, and I think we're going to need to see a lot more of it if we're going to try to head off what's facing us.
What can we as individuals do?
We can get out there and march on the streets. We can make ourselves heard. We can obviously do things that have been talked about for years, that we need to do at home, like drive more fuel-efficient cars, save energy, recycle. All those are great things that we should all be doing. But at the same time, we're going to have to go beyond that. We're going to have to get out there and really, tell the powers that be that we're mad as hell and not going to take it anymore, as the old movie Network said in the 70s. And we're starting to see more of it, but we don't see enough. I mean, I took part in the recent climate march in Los Angeles. There, of course, hundreds of thousands of people were on the streets in this country and all over the world, but these things have got to be ongoing, and we may have to get out there and do blockades, stop trucks from coming in, or expanding, destroying more forests, expanding an oil plant. I mean, that's what we've got to be ready to do. I mean, we have to treat this as an unprecedented threat that it is. And I don't think we see enough activism yet, although we've got people like McKibben and Naomi Klein and others who are at the forefront of this, and Dr. Hansen. So that's my thought on it. That's what we got to do.
I think many people feel helpless because they just don't know where to begin. But one place that I would highly recommend is your blog. I was looking at it yesterday, and I loved, some of the pieces that you've been writing. You published a complete list of the banks to contact about the Keystone XL pipeline funding. You had a piece called Fight Back, Going Local, and all of the data that Trump had purged is now being made available by somebody in Chicago. So, being able to educate oneself, I think, is, a very valuable place to start, just to become aware of exactly what is going on.
Oh, absolutely crucial. And I don't mean to just advocate civil disobedience. I mean, we still have a political system that we are hopefully is going to remain a democracy, and we need to make our voices heard with the people who represent us, and it can have effect. I mean, so far the health care law has stayed in place, and some of that is due to a lot of that, perhaps, to people making their voices heard and at least telling the senators in key states who are sort of on the fence and not just towing the party line that they really don't think this is a good thing. And I think if we do that with things like what they're trying to do to the EPA and so on, and read, I mean, just what is it going to take? Are we going to have to face imminent disaster in order to wake ourselves up? The Thwaites Glacier in Antarctica is going to melt, and that is going to send sea levels escalating as much as 10 to 13 feet. That's not going to happen tomorrow, but it's going to happen in the next, 20, 30 years. Our children and our grandchildren are going to see it, and people are not going to be able to live on the coast anymore. I mean, Florida, parts of Florida, New York, they're going to disappear. And if people don't realize that this is the kinds of things we're facing as these glaciers melt, and the climate is changing much faster in the Arctic and the Antarctic than it is anywhere else, we're going to go down with the ship. So I think we've got to just do everything we can on every level, from the personal way we live our lives to at home to getting the word out in our schools and in our to our Congress people, whoever we can, and on the streets, that this is an emergency unlike anything we've ever faced, and we've got to do something about it, no matter who's in power.
Yeah, we do not have the luxury of remaining in ignorance, do we?
No, we don't. We really, really don't. We can't bury our heads in the sand. And unfortunately, for some time now, I would say since the 60s when I came of age, things have been much more oriented toward everybody's out for themselves and the material world, and we've lost track of the need to do something for the future and of the more spiritual aspect of life. And the only silver lining I see in the fact that this new administration has taken power is that there are a lot of people starting to wake up to the fact that we can't be complacent. I think, unfortunately, had Hillary Clinton won, a lot of people would have just gone on with business as usual and not seen the need to get out there and protect, the immigrants and protect the children from the changes that are happening with the climate, and then that we have to see now in ways that we hadn't perhaps anticipated.
We talked a little bit earlier about, if Trump got kicked out and Pence took over and, what that might possibly look like. What would happen, do you think, if Trump just stayed the course? I mean, are we really between a rock and a hard place there?
Kind of. I think so. But, I mean, as I said, the only thing about Trump is he's just so outrageous and so kind of, obviously narcissistic, obviously kind of crazy. He really represents the shadow side of I've written, one of my books is a biography of James Hillman, and I've written actually two books sort of along psychological lines. And, and he's the shadow side of really of all of us, of our country. I mean, he didn't get in there by accident, and well, maybe he did, but anyway, we've got to look at things in ourselves and how we've allowed things to get to this pass that somebody like him could be, and Pence with him could be running our country. is this really what America is all about? Is this what our inner lives are about? I mean, we've got to shake ourselves up in ways that we hadn't anticipated.
Absolutely, yeah. We're almost out of time. I just want to say one thing, and you could give us a few words about it. I mean, I know that you are doing everything that you possibly can. You're also currently involved in youth mentoring in Los Angeles, and you're starting a Waldorf-type school. Is this, your contribution to the education of the next generation?
Well, I feel that I've been mentoring, especially one young man from South Central Los Angeles. He's now 19, African-American kid that I met by accident, who is just a genius at mythology, an incredible writer, and I realized through him that there's just this tremendous pool of untapped genius that never is allowed to flourish, because most of these kids don't even know, they can't even get out of their neighborhoods. Most of their fathers are in jail. I mean, there's just so much inequity and so much aimed at tamping down the beauty that exists in these kids. So I'm hoping that this Waldorf initiative we're starting in Watts can make a difference in that way.
Dick Russell, thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you, Sandie. I've really enjoyed talking with you today.
Me too. Horsemen of the Apocalypse, Men Who Are Destroying Life on Earth and What It Means to Our Children, has been called one of the most important books of our era. Go out, get a copy, read it, and educate yourself. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer. Thanks for joining me today. If you want to know more about Dick Russell's work, check out his website at dickrussell.org, and I will talk to you again at the same time next week. Till then, it's goodbye from me.